6 million. On paper, it is just a number, but how can you possibly put that into context? It is almost impossible for the brain to fully comprehend a number this large. 6 million. This is roughly the number of Jewish people who perished in the Holocaust. 6 million different people, 6 million different stories, personalities, laughs and smiles, all gone now, forever. We owed it to them to make this journey, attempting to bring into focus the pure significance of this number, but also to show that they did not die for nothing. We are still here, remembering them. This is the story of our journey, from darkness into light.
We landed in Poland and drove straight to the remnants of Warsaw's Jewish cemetery, gaining insight into the vibrant community of Jewish scholars, activists, and visionaries who called the city home. Even amidst the celebration of our Jewish ancestors, the cemetery's inclusion of mass graves from ghetto-induced famine quickly sought to remind us of their demise. We then went to the small area that was once sanctioned as Warsaw's Jewish ghetto. Here, we learned how the rights of Polish Jews to citizenship, commerce, and comfort were slowly and painfully stripped from them, along with their humanity. Many of us were shocked to see this modern Polish life flourish in a territory that we consider so somber, with apartment complexes, stores, traffic, and common citizens nonchalantly occupying the place where our ancestors perished. How could you pretend like nothing ever happened here? This feeling of anger and confusion would follow us throughout the next few days.
Light streams through the tall, thin trees surrounding us. Birds chirp, we walk. The beautiful weather and the scenery are a stark contrast to the horrors committed here in the Tikocin forest. The people of Tikocin were caught unaware. Cluelessly, they were walked down a gravel path to the very spot where we stand now. The forest, the pits, the death pits. The Tikocin Jews were mowed down one at a time, bullet by bullet, until every last Jew was gone. There are no Jews in Tikocin anymore. The Holocaust of bullets made sure of that. Standing here today, overlooking green square fences marking off the pit's borders, you can only begin to imagine the hundreds buried below, killed with no warning, no options, and not a second thought. Looked in the eyes by their killer and bam, gone. Babies were tossed into the air and shot down as if it were a sport. We walked, pressed with a hopeless sense of sadness, wishing we could do more than light candles marked with the names of the slaughtered or say a prayer, wishing for never again. We reached Treblinka. We follow the signs marked extermination camp and proceed into one of the most fatal and efficient death camps ever created. Over 800,000 murdered in just 13 months in this death machine. All evidence of the atrocities performed here have been erased. Only memorials fill the space now where so many reached their end. A long strip of earth coated in black stones where the pit once was. A pit where the Nazis tossed the bodies and then later, to cover their tracks, removed, counted, and burned them. They ground their bones to dust and threw their ashes into a river. No evidence was to be left. No one was to remember the Jews of Treblinka.
Witnessing everything here has caused me to embark on a journey through the 6 stages of grief. Yesterday was the shock of touring Tikocin and Treblinka, but after arriving at Majdanek and looking upon the camp's remains, the 2nd stage of grief, denial, set in. From the hills upon which the camp's 2 memorials were constructed, the expanse of metropolitan Lublin is clearly visible. How is it possible that hundreds of thousands of people were killed there in such close proximity to this major city? How is it possible that the Poles let the Nazis get away with these crimes? These difficult questions running through my head quickly caused me to feel the 3rd stage of grief, anger. Upon touring the crematorium, gas chambers, and viewing the tens of thousands of shoes stolen from the victims of the camps by the Nazis, I felt deep inside me a burning desire for revenge that I had been suppressing since the beginning of the trip. Our walk through Majdanek ended in front of a pile of ash from the burned bodies of thousands of Jews and Polish political prisoners, another reminder of the cruel intentions the Nazis had in store for us. They couldn't even be buried in graves, the bodies not identifiable, lucky if they were still bodies at all. After Majdanek, we boarded the bus for Zbytowska Gora, the location of another Nazi massacre in the forest. As we arrived in the forest, our guide told us that there were over 3 million Catholic Poles who were victims of the Holocaust. In fact, the Nazis' first targets were the Polish clergy, who were hanged in town squares and buried in mass graves. It was then that I skipped to the 5th stage of grief, grieving. I felt the pain of not only the Jews, but the Poles, who were brutalized by invading powers for 5 decades between 1939 and 1989. As we moved further into the forest, we came upon a fenced-off area with stones, Israeli flags, and candles lining the perimeter, another mass grave. Unique in such that below it lie the remains of 800 children. Because bullets were viewed as too expensive, many of these children had been stabbed to death by bayonets. Infants were thrown into the air and shot like skeet for the enjoyment of the German soldiers. In silence, we hugged each other as the tears poured down our cheeks. After reciting a prayer of mourning, it was time to leave. I was overrun with sadness and anger that we were able to walk away while the hundreds who lay here could not.
Today, we walked into a concentration camp we had seen countless images of before. But walking through the gates reading Arbeit macht frei, meaning work will set you free, the pictures could not do justice to the horrors of the camp. This was Auschwitz. We walked through underground prisons that even in the 70-degree weather were cold, damp, and terrifying. We walked through the only remaining gas chamber in Auschwitz. The walls were stained blue from the Zyklon B. Our fingers traced over the scratch marks left by those who suffocated to death in those halls, but we could still walk out alive. We visited Birkenau, a camp where 90% of those who entered would never walk out of. Though the day was beautiful and the grass green, our tour guide quickly reminded us that there was never any sun or any grass at Birkenau. The days were gloomy and dark, full of labor and beatings. The grass wasn't there because even if it grew, it would be eaten by those who lived there. There were dozens of different exhibits. We saw almost everything that the Holocaust victims and survivors brought with them to the camp, from piles of old shoes to suitcases and locks of hair. Once all the inmates arrived at the camps, they were dehumanized in every facet, most importantly by having their names replaced with numbers. The last exhibit we saw was a list of 4 million names of Jewish Holocaust victims. This was the first time that we had any physical understanding of what 6 million people looked like. Our chaperone Lizzie told us that if we were to hold a moment of silence for every victim of the Holocaust, there would be silence for 21 years. But these were not just names or moments of silence. There were mothers, fathers, children, dreamers, intellectuals, lovers, teachers, and clergy. There were 6 million individual stories.
We ended our trip with the March of the Living. The March of the Living is an event held on Holocaust Remembrance Day, where 15,000 people from all around the world come together to march from Auschwitz to Birkenau, a walk known as the Death March. The feeling in Auschwitz that day was different than the day of our tour in Auschwitz. Having 15,000 Jewish people gathered in this camp was uplifting, empowering, and inspiring. This community filled with Argentinians, Canadians, Indians, Belgians, Cincinnatians, and many more marched to remember our shared history. We marched to show that we will not be silent. We will not allow a Holocaust ever again, and we will remember the lives lost. The most powerful experience of the entire trip thus far occurred after the march as we went to sit to watch the ceremony. A Holocaust survivor stood in front of a 15,000-person crowd, draped head to toe in his striped uniform, wearing a bracelet with the number given to him at Auschwitz written across it. He spoke of his family, his sisters, mother, father, each of whom were taken from him and murdered. It can be difficult to comprehend the immensity of the Holocaust, but his one story touched us and made us understand in a way that we haven't before. Each life lost was a person just like him, someone with a family and friends, history, and a future. That moment of understanding reiterated to us why we were marching. We stood united as a Jewish people that day. We knew why we were marching. We marched because our ancestors could not. We marched to put an end to the hate and bigotry that allowed the Holocaust to occur. We marched to show that we are strong and we will fight to stay alive. In our week in Poland, we had seen so much darkness. We saw graves, concentration camps, and memorials. We had seen and walked on the grounds where thousands upon thousands were murdered in cold blood. But the Nazis could not put an end to the Jewish people. We are still here today, and we will continue to march and to never forget. We march to persevere from darkness to light.
Our week in Poland was one of the longest and darkest weeks of our lives, but it was all put into context in the following days. It was a necessity that we venture here to dig up the past. We had to experience all of the bone-chilling realities that occurred 75 years ago. From all of that darkness, there is still a major source of light to be found, the Jewish state of Israel. After liberation, hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors moved to Israel in search of refuge. After seeing just a glimpse of what they went through, we now understood that Israel was more than just a country. It was a place of pride for the Jewish people, a safe haven where all Jews are always welcomed with open arms, free of all persecution.
On top of being a sanctuary for the Jewish people, Israel is one of the most geographically diverse and culturally rich places you'll ever visit. From the desert,
To the mountains,
To the beaches,
to the lowest place on earth,
from the religious villages,
to the big cities,
to Jerusalem, holy for all religions and teachings.
Israel simply has it all. Its importance is paramount. Its existence is necessary. Without it, there is no light for the Jewish people.